tea and coffee plants. These are hugely important economic crops, with markets worth $17 billion a year for tea and $102 billion a year for coffee. Both the tea and coffee plants belong to the same massive group within the flowering plants, called the asterids. Asterids comprise around 80,000 species across 100 families, including things like the nightshades like potatoes and tomatoes, as well as the tea and coffee families, Teaceae and Rubiaceae. The tea and coffee families are actually not that closely related to each other. The coffee family, Rubiaceae, seems to belong to this subgroup of asterids called Gentianales up here, while tea fits in with a subgroup called Ericales down here. Here's a similar representation, but trimmed down to make it easier to see. Ignore the cocoa plant for now, that's a bit of a spoiler for later on. But here's the thing, the expectation in evolutionary science is that two species or families with similar traits, like caffeine production, should tend to be closely related to each other, with a single common ancestor that they both inherited that shared trait from. Tea and coffee we've already mentioned, but some species of citrus, the chocolate plant, and guarana plants also produce caffeine, as well as the cola plant, yerba mate, and holly bushes, just to name a few more. These plants belong to a relatively small number of families that are not closely related to one another. Remember that we saw where the chocolate plant fits in relative to tea and coffee earlier on. Something really interesting about this case of convergent evolution is that each different convergence on the caffeine molecule found a different way to synthesize that same identical molecule, either by using different biochemical pathways or by using different enzymes to catalyze the steps in that pathway. As a side note, lots of the biosynthesis and physiology of caffeine in plants is not very well researched or characterized, with a strong preference for research on tea and coffee plants, probably for obvious reasons. So that's what we'll have to mostly focus on here. This figure shows all of the possible biochemical pathways to make caffeine from its alkaloid precursors, xanthine and xanthosine. The pathway highlighted in bold at the bottom here is the one used in tea and coffee plants, first converting the xanthosine precursor to methylxanthine, then to theobromine, and then finally to caffeine. While the pathway is the same in these two species, each uses different enzymes to perform it, encoded by related but different genes. Incidentally, the theobromine precursor of caffeine is one of the compounds that contributes to the flavor of chocolate. It's also what makes chocolate poisonous to dogs. It was discovered recently that other caffeine-producing plants, chocolate, guarana, and citrus, use different pathways to tea and coffee, and different genes encode the enzymes needed to perform them. They also start from a different alkaloid precursor, with the chocolate, citrus, and guarana plants starting the process of synthesizing caffeine with xanthine, rather than xanthosine like tea and coffee do. Citrus even seems to have two possible routes through the pathways shown in this diagram, able to modify xanthine in two different ways to start the process, before making theophylline and using that as the final precursor for caffeine, rather than using theobromine like the other caffeine-producing plants do. This case of convergence seems to have happened through multiple independent cases of gene duplication, where sections of DNA accidentally get copied twice during replication, resulting in multiple copies of the same gene. This was followed by the subsequent alteration and recruitment of those duplicated ancestral genes into the caffeine production pathway. For this family of genes that are involved here to be shared in both tea and coffee, that means they must have been maintained in the genomes of those plants for between 100 and 120 million years since their last common ancestor in the Cretaceous period, then independently turned to caffeine production. That would make the genetic architecture necessary for making caffeine as old, or maybe even older, than Spinosaurus. So it isn't that the process for making this useful compound has been preserved by evolution in all the different lineages that produce it. It's had multiple different origins, each using different biochemical processes and encoded by different versions of the same set of ancestral genes, in each case separated by many tens of millions of years. There are countless cases of convergent evolution, where distantly related groups evolved to have either very similar or even the same trait. This is what seems to have happened here with caffeine. The caffeine molecule produced by the tea and coffee plants is identical, but the two families are not close relatives within the asteroid group of plants. And in fact, only a handful of species in each family can make the caffeine molecule. Coffea arabica and Canaphora, and a handful of other Coffea species, are the only ones out of the whole Rubiaceae family, containing somewhere between 11 and 15,000 species, to produce caffeine. Meanwhile, Camellia sinensis, the species from which all commercially grown caffeinated teas are cultivated, is the only one out of the roughly 600 species of the Teaceae family to do so.